Jack Mercer had nothing left to offer the world but his blood, until it became the one thing that could save Evelyn Marlowe, the dying CEO who had built an empire of steel yet couldn't outpace her fate. His daughter Emily clutched a sketchbook, unaware her small kindness might change everything. But what happens when survival ties strangers together? Can it spark a love neither expected? Stay until the end. The rain drummed against the tall glass panes of the hospital, each drop sounding like a clock striking time she no longer believed she had. Evelyn Marlowe lay propped against a bank of pillows, her figure slender beneath white sheets, her breath shallow but measured. Machines hummed a soft chorus around her. Blinking lights reflected faintly in her pale green eyes. Her hair, once impeccably styled, now hung loose against her cheeks, dark strands clinging with the dampness of fever. She had built towers of steel and glass in her city, but here, inside the sterile room, she could command nothing. Not her body, not her fate. Outside the door, two physicians stood in muted conversation. Their words carried like a low tide through the narrow crack. No response to treatment. She's burning through options. Another voice, equally subdued. We've run every match. No compatible donor exists in the registry. The syllables fell heavy, deliberate, meant to soften what was blunt. There was no cure for her. Evelyn closed her eyes, turning her face toward the window. A silver fountain pen rested on the bedside table, its cap worn smooth where her thumb had pressed against it countless times. Her father's gift, the one he had said would outlast both of them. She had signed contracts, treaties, expansions with that pen. It was her last tether to a man who had believed in permanence. Tonight it felt more like an anchor, holding her in place as everything else receded. Miles away, under the flickering buzz of a rural clinic's lights, Jack Mercer offered his arm to a nurse with quiet indifference. The needle slid in, and blood flowed dark and steady into the waiting bag. His jaw was square, his gaze unfocused, watching neither the collection nor the posters peeling on the walls. On the chair across from him sat Emily, small legs swinging above the floor, a sketchbook open on her knees. She pressed her pencil hard enough to nearly tear the page, drawing lines that curled into the shape of a bird. Jack glanced at her, softened for a moment, then looked back to the wall. He had given blood often, sometimes for the stipend, sometimes out of habit, carried from his years in uniform. There was a discipline in it, a sense that even if nothing else in his life could be controlled, at least he could still give. Emily glanced up at him. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Only a little," he murmured. "It helps someone who needs it more." His words were calm, rehearsed, but there was weight beneath them. Emily considered this, then nodded as if filing the lesson somewhere permanent. By dawn, Evelyn's condition worsened. Fever blistered her skin, and her breaths came uneven, a ragged tide. Charts scattered across the nurse's station recorded her decline like a countdown, until the lab returned a call. An anomaly, a match found outside the registry. A donor whose blood had already shown properties that startled even the pathologist. Cells aligning, repairing, knitting what had been breaking apart. The order was swift, urgent. The name attached, Jack Mercer. When they asked, Jack didn't hesitate. He agreed, not because of Evelyn Marlowe's wealth or reputation. He hadn't even recognized her name, but because Emily had been listening wide-eyed when the request came. "If it were your mama," he whispered to her later, "wouldn't you hope someone said yes?" The first transfusion was carried out in silence, except for the steady beep of machines and the hiss of oxygen. Jack sat across the room, his sleeve rolled to the elbow, the needle steady in his arm. His gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the linoleum, a soldier's stare that endured without question. Evelyn, half conscious, turned her head just enough to see him. He was not polished, not refined, his hair slightly unkempt, his boots worn from work. Yet there was a steadiness in his posture, a kind of rooted calm she had not felt from anyone in years. Their eyes did not meet. Not then, but she remembered the line of his scar across one brow, the quiet endurance in his stillness. The moment was fleeting. Her lashes grew heavy, the world fading as new strength began to hum through her veins. Later, when Jack was discharged from his chair and Emily tugged his hand toward the door, Evelyn stirred in the darkened room. On her bedside table, beneath her pen, lay a folded sheet of paper. Emily's sketch, slipped in unnoticed. A bird in mid-flight, wings arched wide, its lines uneven but full of motion. Evelyn touched it with trembling fingers. For the first time in months, she allowed her lips to bend into something close to a smile. The rain had not stopped. It rattled the windows like an impatient visitor, but inside the room, something had shifted. Not health, not yet, but possibility. She lay back, her hand resting lightly on the drawing, wondering about the stranger whose blood now ran with hers, and the small child who had given her a fragment of sky. She closed her eyes, the machines hummed settling into rhythm with her heartbeat. For the first time in countless nights, she did not feel entirely alone. Evelyn's recovery came like dawn through fog, incremental, hesitant, impossible to predict. Some morning she could rise without trembling, her step steady enough to pace the length of her room. On others, fever shadows lingered, forcing her back into the sterile embrace of sheets and silence. Her staff applauded progress in measured tones, but Evelyn sensed the truth in their eyes. They had already buried her in their minds, and each breath she drew unsettled their certainty. The transfusions continued. Jack arrived without flourish, as though entering a battlefield rather than a skyscraper glass and steel. He never spoke of inconvenience, never lingered longer than required. Yet there was no mistaking his presence. The nurses noted his discipline, the way he bore discomfort without complaint. Evelyn noted the way he kept his gaze lowered, not out of deference but out of habit, as if his eyes had grown weary of demanding explanations the world never gave. Emily accompanied him most days, her sketchbook a constant companion. She perched in corners, feet tucked beneath her, pages filling with lopsided animals and crooked houses. The drawings were not remarkable, but the act of giving them away was. Evelyn found herself collecting them like tokens, birds, trees, once even a clumsy attempt at a horse. She kept them beneath her planner, a hidden gallery that reminded her of mornings she once believed she would never see. It was Emily who breached the distance first. One afternoon, while Jack's blood moved through tubes toward Evelyn, Emily wandered to her bedside. She climbed onto the chair and studied Evelyn with the unflinching scrutiny only children possess. "Do you write stories with your pen?" she asked, her voice light, curious. Evelyn blinked, startled, then let a small smile soften her lips. "Not stories," she said quietly. "Agreements, promises, things that last." Emily nodded, thoughtful. "Drawings last too, even if the paper gets crumpled." She pressed a new sheet into Evelyn's hand. A bird again, wings stretched wider than before. Evelyn traced the lines absently, marveling at the boldness of a child who offered pieces of her world without fear of rejection. Jack watched from across the room, his expression unreadable. Yet when Evelyn glanced his way, she thought she glimpsed something behind his guarded stillness, gratitude perhaps, or relief. It unsettled her more than the transfusion itself. As her body grew stronger, Evelyn returned to quiet ritual her illness had birthed. Letters she would never send. With her father's pen she wrote by lamplight, pouring truths she could not speak aloud. To her younger self she wrote warnings. To the daughter she never had, she wrote of mistakes she wished undone. And to the man whose blood had become her lifeline, she wrote confessions she would never dare hand over. The act of writing steadied her, the ink bleeding like a private testimony that kept loneliness at bay. Jack, for his part, carried his own rituals. Evelyn learned them not through questions. He offered few answers, but through observation. The way he checked the time on a cracked glass wristwatch before each appointment, even though its hands were unreliable. The way he folded Emily's jacket before placing it on the chair, a soldier's precision lingering in civilian motions. He rarely spoke of the past, yet silence itself became his biography, its edges sharp enough to suggest wounds no surgeon could stitch. Their worlds had not been more opposed, hers glass and marble, his wood and earth. Yet in the corridors of the hospital, these differences blurred. She began to wait for his arrival, though she disguised it as coincidence. He began to linger an extra breath before leaving, though he masked it as politeness. Neither named the shift, but both felt it pressing quietly between them. One evening, after a meeting that drained the last of her strength, Evelyn returned to her office and nearly collapsed at the threshold. Jack was already there, summoned for another transfusion. His reflex was immediate. His arm braced around her, steadying her without word or hesitation. For a heartbeat, she leaned into him, her composure abandoned, her pulse racing against his sleeve. Outside, rain struck the windows, drowning out everything but their breathing. She pulled away quickly, the moment dismissed with a murmur about fatigue. Jack did not press, did not question, but the weight of his support lingered in her chest long after he released her arm. Later that night, when she opened her planner to review schedules, a folded scrap slipped free. Emily's bird, traced clumsily in blue ink. Evelyn sat at her desk, exhaustion pressing heavy, and ran her fingertip over the wings. The child's faith was unshaken. Each drawing seemed to declare that flight was possible, even for those who had forgotten how. She whispered the word almost involuntarily, free. It hung in the empty office like a vow, fragile but unbroken. The city lights pulsed beyond the glass, restless and relentless. Yet for the first time, Evelyn did not feel imprisoned within them. Somewhere between the silver pen, the child's drawings, and the quiet steadiness of man whose blood now beat within her veins, a crack had opened the armor she had worn for decades. Through it slipped not fear, but the faintest outline of hope. Evelyn's return to health was announced with the same precision her company used to unveil new acquisitions. Polished press releases, rehearsed smiles, and carefully chosen photographs. Yet behind the gleam of headlines, she felt like an intruder inside her own resurrection. Applause echoed in the boardroom when she appeared, but it rang hollow. Their praise was less for her survival than for the stability of their profits. She sat at the head of the long table, the silver pen poised in her fingers, and felt as though she were signing documents from a distance, her soul a step removed from her body. Jack kept to the periphery of that world. The transfusions had lessened, though the hospital still called him in for checks. He remained steadfast in his refusal to be paraded, to be made a symbol. When Evelyn's advisor suggested public recognition for her miracle donor, he declined without hesitation. It wasn't a story, he told the nurse. It was blood. His life, and Emily's, belonged far from flashbulbs. Still, their paths crossed more often than Evelyn anticipated. She had grown accustomed to his silence, the way his presence steadied her in a way medicine could not. There was no judgment in his gaze, only endurance, a kind of quiet loyalty he didn't name. Emily continued to carry her sketchbook. Filling it with drawings Evelyn now awaited like letters from a pen pal she had never chosen but couldn't do without. The first evening she invited them into her home, the rain fell in steady sheets against the glass walls of her penthouse. She had hesitated before extending the invitation, her pride warning her against it, but something heavier urged her forward. Jack arrived in his worn jacket, shoulders damp, boots leaving faint prints across the marble. He looked impossibly out of place, yet also entirely real, the only unpolished thing in rooms that reeked of curated perfection. Emily, unbothered by grandeur, wandered wide-eyed to the high-ceilinged space, her laughter echoing in corners that had long known only silence. Dinner was simple. Evelyn had instructed the staff to keep it unadorned, but still she saw Jack glance around the table as if he were trespassing. She broke the tension by confessing, "Even I feel like a guest in this place." His eyes lifted to hers then, and for the first time she saw recognition in them, an acknowledgement of loneliness shared, though never spoken. Emily, oblivious to subtext, asked bluntly why Evelyn lived so high above the city if it made her sad. The honesty was almost unbearable. Evelyn surprised herself by laughing, a sound raw and unfamiliar. Habit, she admitted. I forgot there were other choices. Later, when Emily drifted asleep on the couch, the two adults found themselves standing by the balcony doors. The city stretched below in a constellation of lights blurred by rain. Evelyn's hand rested against the glass, cool beneath her palm. Jack stood close enough that she could feel the steadiness of his presence, though he did not intrude on her space. "It's a long way down," she said softly, though she wasn't looking at the street but at her own past, the years she had spent climbing, only to find herself isolated at the peak. Jack answered with simplicity that disarmed her. "Not if you know how to land." His words held weight, carved from experiences he did not share, but which she could almost sense. She turned toward him then, studying the faint scar on his brow, the lines at the corners of his eyes. He did not avert his gaze this time. For the first time, silence between them felt less like distance and more like recognition. As the evening deepened, she showed him the letters she had written in secret. She didn't let him read them, her pride still too fierce for that, but she allowed him to hold a stack, her father's pen tucked between the pages. His hands were callous, rough against the fine paper, yet his grip was careful, reverent. "Sometimes writing is just breathing differently," she murmured. He nodded, offering no reply, but she felt as though he understood more than she had said. The storm outside grew heavier, lightning flashing in pale veins across the horizon. They stood side by side, their reflections mingling in the dark glass. Evelyn thought of the child asleep behind them, of the man who had given part of himself without asking for return, and of the way her own heart seemed to beat differently in their company. She had not asked for this entanglement, yet it bound her more firmly than any contract she had signed. When Jack finally gathered Emily and prepared to leave, Evelyn walked them to the door. The hallway beyond yawned with cold marble, but within the frame of her home, something warmer had been sparked. Emily stirred, half asleep, and pressed one last drawing into Evelyn's hand before letting her father lift her. A house this time, crooked, uneven, but with a bright square of yellow at its center. Evelyn held it to her chest long after they disappeared into the rain. Alone again, she returned to the balcony. The city sprawled beneath her, vast and glittering, yet she no longer felt suspended above it. Instead, she felt tethered, anchored by the unlikely presence of a man and his child who had entered her life not through strategy but through sacrifice. For the first time, she did not measure her days in contracts or meetings but in breaths, in moments that stretched towards something unnamed. She turned the drawing over in her hands, tracing the small bright square. Perhaps it was a window, perhaps a light. Whatever it was, she understood instinctively. It was an invitation, and she was no longer certain she wanted to refuse. The weeks that followed unfolded with a rhythm Evelyn had never known before, unhurried, imperfect, stitched together with moments she would once have dismissed as trivial. She rose each morning with strength that no longer felt borrowed but slowly earned. The sterile smell of hospitals receded into memory, replaced by the scent of ink on paper, of rain drifting through open windows, and which shavings carried faintly from Jack's world into her own. Her days at the company returned, though they no longer held the same power over her. The board still pressed for expansion, for new acquisitions, for strategies built on control. But her mind wandered now to a workshop far from glass towers, to the sound of a child's laughter echoing in spaces untouched by ambition. She found herself less interested in conquering markets than in discovering how long she could sit in silence without feeling the need to fill it. Jack did not change much in those weeks, and perhaps that was why Evelyn found herself drawn more deeply toward him. He remained steady, quiet, grounded in a way her world had never allowed. She watched him once as he mended Emily's backpack, his fingers moving with patience through worn fabric, each stitch deliberate. It was not the act of sewing that held her, but the gentleness of it, the way he poured himself into small repairs, as though saving what could be saved was the only duty worth keeping. When she asked him once why he never let her repay him for the transfusions, he simply said, "It wasn't something to sell. It was a life, and you keep living it. His refusal to accept gratitude in the language of wealth unsettled her, because it forced her to recognize how rarely she had encountered anything freely given. Yet beneath their quiet exchanges, fear still threaded through her. She worried she was taking too much, his blood, his time, his silence. She worried that one day he would turn and see her not as the woman he had helped, but as the weight he could no longer carry. So she tried clumsily to create distance. She arrived late to dinners, declined invitations with excuses about work, and sent her assistant to deliver messages she once would have spoken herself. Jack never confronted her about it, never demanded answers, but she noticed the way his eyes grew more guarded, as if he were retreating to the same walls he had spent years behind. It was Emily who broke through. One evening, Evelyn found an envelope tucked into her planner, the paper soft and smudged with pencil. Inside was a letter written in the uneven scrawl of a child. "You don't have to be alone anymore. You belong with us now." The words made her chest ache in places she kept locked since her father's death. She pressed the letter to her lips and closed her eyes, knowing she could not keep pretending that retreat was safety. The next morning she left her office before dawn and drove without her driver, following the narrow roads until they carried her into the quiet heart of Jack's town. The workshop sat at the edge of a clearing, its roof patched, its windows glowing faintly against the gray light. She stepped inside and found him bent over a length of cedar, his hands rough with sawdust, his watch cracked and stubborn on his wrist. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face, but he did not speak. Evelyn walked forward slowly, her heels crunching against his shavings, and placed her father's silver pen on his bench. The gesture said what her voice could not, that her life, her future, the words she had yet to write, she no longer wanted to hold alone. Jack studied the pen, then her face, his eyes steady and unreadable. For a long moment the room held only the sound of rain against the roof and the faint rasp of their breathing. Then his hand closed gently over hers, not possessive, not hesitant, simply certain. She felt the warmth of his palm, the solidity of a man who had weathered storms far greater than hers, and knew the distance she had tried to create was already undone. They did not speak of love that day. There were no grand declarations, no promises carved into air. Instead, there was a small moment, Evelyn leaning her head against his chest, hearing the quiet thrum of his heart beneath her ear, while Emily laughed in the yard outside. It was enough. It was more than she had ever imagined she would be given. The weeks blurred again, but this time with a different cadence. Evelyn no longer measured her days in contracts signed or stock prices shifting, but in the rituals that stitched their 3 lives together. She watched Emily draw at the workshop table, her sketches now filled with brighter colors, houses steadier, birds with wings stretched wide. She joined Jack in small repairs, sanding wood until her hands ached, surprised to find joy in the rough simplicity of creating something solid. And in the evenings, when the city lights glowed far in the distance, she wrote new letters, not to ghosts of her past, but to the life she was slowly allowing herself to claim. One night, as they sat by the fireplace Jack had built with his own hands, Evelyn opened a box she had carried for years. Inside lay the unsent letters, hundreds of them, folded and worn. She placed them on the hearth, watching flames curl the edges into ash. Jack did not ask what they contained. He simply took her hand, steadying her as she let go of the weight she had carried alone for too long. The act was quiet, unceremonious, yet felt like a ceremony, an unspoken vow that from this moment forward, the words she wrote would not be confessions to emptiness but part of a life shared. Their bond grew not through sudden passion, but through the accumulation of quiet kindnesses. Jack began leaving his cracked watch on the windowsill of her study, a symbol of time he no longer needed to guard so fiercely. Evelyn placed Emily's drawings beside her father's pen on her desk, a constellation of past and future. Emily herself became the bridge between them, her laughter loosening Evelyn's reserve, her trust teaching Evelyn that family could be chosen as much as it was inherited. The city continued to move around them, relentless in its demands, but Evelyn no longer felt beholden to its pace. She still attended meetings, still signed contracts, but when her pen moved across paper now, She felt less like a commander and more like a participant in something greater than herself. The weight of her empire remained, but it was balanced by the small, fierce weight of belonging she carried home each evening. On the wall of the workshop, above a shelf of unfinished carvings, 3 objects hung side by side: the silver pen, Jack's cracked glass watch, and Emily's drawing of a bird in flight. They did not match, yet together they told a story no photograph or article could capture. A story of survival not by conquest, but by trust. Of redemption not in grandeur, but in the simplest of gestures: a transfusion, a drawing, a hand placed on another hand. As winter gave way to spring, Evelyn stood once more on the balcony of her penthouse. But this time she was not alone. Jack leaned against the railing beside her. Emily perched between them, her hair ruffled by the wind. The city sprawled beneath them, vast and indifferent, but Evelyn's heart no longer raced at its cold expanse. She felt the warmth of Jack's hand in hers, the weight of Emily's head against her side, and understood that survival had been only the beginning. What mattered now was what they built together in the silence after the storm. The moment was unremarkable to the world. No cameras, no announcements, no applause. Yet to Evelyn, it was everything. She breathed in, steady and sure, and allowed herself the rare gift of peace. And in the quiet of that balcony, surrounded by rain-washed air and the steady beat of lives intertwined, Evelyn knew at last that it was true. If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you are watching from. We'd love to have your feedback.